So a couple of days ago, I got asked to do a video on how to trim or prune succulents. It wasn't really specified what type of succulents, so I'm just going to group them together based on how they grow, and I'll show you what your options are. Our first group of succulents are going to be single rosettes, so they can often grow over the edge of the pot, and some people don't like that, but unfortunately there is very little you can do with succulents like these. So what I mean is by single rosettes is just plants that do not have any offsets and just grow like this. It can be really difficult to make these appear smaller. There's a couple of things you can do, but it will not drastically change the way these guys are. So the first thing that you can do if you have a plant like this and you don't like how big it is, you can take a few leaves out. I would not recommend cutting through the leaves because they are just going to kind of die off eventually and they will look ugly and brown. So you can pretty much just I really don't want to ruin these plants because I am going to eventually sell them and they are looking absolutely stunning, so I'm just kind of going to pretend to take them off. A lot of the times the leaves will come off quite easily. Oh, maybe I can do it on this one because that's got a few damaged leaves. So unfortunately this guy got a little bit too much water and there's edema that has damaged the leaves, and they are not going to, this is not going to heal, so it's always going to be there. But what you can do, you can just kind of pull them, twist them away, and you can do a couple of rows. So you, instead of having this huge thing, you can go 2 or 3 rows, and then you will end up with basically just that. If you kind of took all of that off, and you'll just basically go one by one from the bottom and then just work your way up to your desired size. Now, as I said before, I would definitely not recommend just cutting halfway through the leaves. It will not do any good. They will not regrow. They will just die off and make the whole plant look ugly. The second thing you can do is behead the plant. So you would take pretty much the top off, and what you can do from there is just wait for new rosettes to appear. Instead of one rosette you would have multiples. After that you can take the bottom leaves off, so you will kind of have just this concentrated growth on the top. Now I can show you actually an example of exactly that. So I have beheaded this Echeveria bluebird last year. It has taken a year for it to recover. I will pull up a picture of what it looked like before I beheaded it. So this is what it was before. It was growing a little bit too tall, and so I just cut the top off, and then once these rosettes were kind of big enough, I pulled off all the old leaves and just let it grow like this. And that is exactly what you can do if you kind of want to temporarily minimize the size. So obviously these rosettes will also grow. Then you can kind of pull them out and just have this one smaller rosette on the top. If you do go down the road of beheading and you only have one single stalk or one single rosette, I would definitely recommend to keep a few leaves on the stalk, because if you don't, the stalk is likely to die off, and so you would just be left with this kind of cutting that you've got from taking the top off. If you have a multi-branched plant like this, you can take the whole rosette off and it will still regrow because it's got all of these leaves here from the other stalks that are connected to this one. But if it's just a single one, it's definitely better to leave a few leaves behind. Things become a lot easier when you've got clumps like this. You can very easily take the rosettes that you don't want off. You can either just pull them off if they are growing out like this, if they've got a big enough stalk. If you have a tight clump like this, you might want to just take the plant out of the pot and then individually start taking the rosettes that you don't want, that you want to trim away out. So you can start by pulling, or if there's a stalk you can take scissors and just cut them off. A great thing about this is that whatever you trim away, whatever rosettes you trim away, you can plant as well. So say I don't want this one, and I'll just take it off, pull it out. Now some of them will already have roots, and you can leave this for about 24 to 48 hours so this wound dries out. It will prevent any fungus or organisms that can harm your plant from getting into the plant when the wound is dry, so always wait a little bit before you plant fresh cuttings. And after about 24 hours you can plant this in a separate pot or in a separate part of the garden, and eventually you will get this from just this little bit. So yeah, that is one amazing thing about trimming succulents. Whatever you trim, even with the single rosettes, when you're taking leaves off and you separate them properly, so leaves like this are unlikely to grow, but if you take the leaf off entire without it breaking, it will strike and it will give you a new plant, just like this guy over here. So this little plant is growing just from this one leaf. Some succulents are easier than others, but usually it's quite easy to achieve this. Clumping succulents, you can just pull the clumps apart, and then if the rosette is still too big and you want to kind of trim away more, you can take the leaves out to reduce the size further. Okay, so the third group of succulents would be your small shrubby succulents. So they can be your calancos or your cotyledons or a sediveria, or I think graptosedum, I'm not quite sure with these yellow ones. Another sediveria, but they will all grow multiple branches from the main kind of stalk, and they are very, very trimmable. You can even train them to grow a certain way. Now, if you want to propagate your trimmings, I would recommend that you take off bits that are quite mature. So I wouldn't take off just this tiny little bit, I would take the whole thing where the stalk goes a little bit more woody. Same with these guys. So if it's soft like this, I would just leave it. I mean, you may get it to grow, but it's definitely more reliable when you take a bigger cutting off. Again, I wouldn't recommend to just chop the leaves halfway through. They are likely to die, although some of these, like the calancos, will sometimes grow even if the leaf is just cut halfway through. You don't have to take it away entire. And yeah, with these you can just trim away whatever you don't like, whatever's kind of growing out. You can take that off if you don't like your plants to hang over, or if they're growing into something else, if they're overshadowing another succulent. Same with these guys. It's really, really easy. And as a bonus, when you do trim them, you will get little babies like this guy here, and a lot of times you will end up with a bushier plant. Having said that, I would not over trim them, because if you trim too much, sometimes they do not come back as vigorous, especially if they are in pots and they've got like limited pot space and limited nutrients. If you do want to trim back quite a bit and you expect them to bush up more, I would recommend either giving them a little bit of fertilizer or just repotting into fresh new potting mix. Next are your ground covers. So ground covers are super duper trimmable, and when they are planted in the garden they can become a bit vigorous. So trimming is almost a must if they are growing a bit too well, because they can very quickly grow over other succulents and kind of smother them. Now with these you don't have to be really that precious. You can just like pinch bits off and then either plant them, or if you have a lot of them you can chuck them away or give them to someone else. You can also take scissors to these, but again, if you are a little bit too harsh with them and you cut halfway through the leaves will go brown and will die off. So the plant will not look that great if you start cutting through the leaves. I would just recommend pinching whole branches like here. You just take the whole thing off. So yeah, with these guys there is not really anything special that you have to do other than not cutting the leaves off. You can just take scissors, trim them, or pinch away little bits that you don't like or that are growing over other plants. Easy peasy. Right, so next we've got our hanging succulents. So these guys are just hanging outside in my garden under a tree. They really like it here. And with these, there is not really anything special that you need to do. So plants like ripsalis, you can just take any part off that you really like. If you do want to repot it and try and grow another plant from your cuttings, I would suggest again going with the bigger branches. So trimming, not just going and taking the little tiny bits off. I would go and take this whole thing, and you will instantly, in a couple of months time, have a new big plant just growing from this. But yeah, ripsalis are super easy to trim. If they can get quite long, especially if they are in big pots like this. So I did trim this plant because I was propagating from it, and it went all the way down to the ground level. Now same with your string of pearls, string of bananas, or whatever other string of plant you have. You can trim the whole string. If you want to propagate, these little tiny new shoots do not propagate as well as your bigger ones. And also the string of plants from the Senecio genus will have little roots as they grow on random bits of the string or the stalk. And if you want your cuttings to kind of root very quickly, you can just take the cutting a couple of leaves above the root, and it will grow very quickly and very easily. So again, just like with the other plants that have succulent thick leaves like this, I wouldn't really recommend cutting the leaves in half. Also, these guys don't really grow well from leaves. You can do it, but it's not very reliable, and it is much easier to grow them from the actual cuttings. Now I want to do these Dracaenas, or as they were formerly known, Sansevierias, mother-in-laws, whatever you want to call them, because they are quite popular and they tend to grow quite tall. So I've seen a lot of people just trimming them like halfway through, and then what you end up with, just like with the other succulents, you will just end up with this ugly brown bit where you cut them off and the whole leaf will eventually kind of die. So if your Sansevierias are getting quite tall, like this one here, I would recommend, if you have to take the leaves off, I would just go right to the bottom so you don't have this ugly brown bit halfway through the plant. And also they spread via rhizomes. So as you can see here, there's a rhizome that goes underneath. They are subterranean, and you can kind of just, here we go. So you can cut them away from the rest of the plant and just either plant them elsewhere. They are a great plant, but in parts of Australia and I think in other parts of the world, they can be classed as weeds. So do be careful if you are planting them in the garden. They can become pretty weedy and spread far and wide before you know it. Because they spread underground, they can go to the neighbors very quickly, and it is just best to keep them in pots, especially if you live in a climate where they grow quite well. So yeah, either pull them apart and you can take out the tall sections entirely, or you can just trim them back at the bottom. Now the great thing about Sansevieria leaves is that you can kind of cut them into sections and they will propagate even from like little bits of a leaf. It doesn't have to be the whole leaf. You can cut it up to 4 or 5 centimeter sections and just plant that, and you will very easily get a new plant out of it. So next up are Aeonium, and I do have a separate video on how to trim Aeonium succulents. They are very popular. They are found in gardens all over the world and very easily trimmable. Just like with the other ones, when you're trimming Aeonium, I would go for the whole part, so for the whole stalk, rather than just, it's not great to trim leaves because they will die and they will look pretty ugly. When you cut rosettes of Aeonium, you will get kind of this effect. So you will get a lot of little offsets growing at the cut point. It makes them very easy to propagate and spread. Also, when you cut off a branch and you plant them straight into the garden or into pots, it is very, very easy to propagate. It will root fast, but unlike other succulents, Aeonium grow throughout the cooler months, so I would not recommend propagating them in summer, but more in like autumn or early spring. And the last group of plants are your larger shrubs, so Chrysula, there's another one, or here we've got Portulacaria afra. Now all of these succulents can grow quite tall and quite big, certainly a lot bigger than most succulents, and they are very trimmable, so you don't have to be very precious when you trim them. Basically just trim parts that you don't want. And with these succulents it is also possible to trim them into shape. So what I see quite often is these Portulacarias trimmed into Christmas trees. You can also do a bowl, and you can kind of do the same with the Chrysulas. You can take little bits off, or you can take whole branches. And once again, just like with the other succulents, do not trim leaves halfway through. Take the whole thing off, otherwise you'll just end up with this unsightly brown leaf. So yeah, that is how you trim succulents. I hope this video was useful. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I will see you all next time. Thank you very much for watching.